Dobry wieczór, grüß Gott, guten Abend. Hello everyone. With the Habsburg monarchy, there are a lot of myths, and there is just one which Maciej mentioned. Of course, I do not speak all the languages of the monarchy. I wish I could. I'm working on some of them. It's a hard lifetime work to know and use all the languages of the monarchy. So what I want to share with you is images, ideas. You will be exposed to quite a lot of facts and images, and do not hesitate afterwards to ask any question about any detail I might have been too rapid in my presentations. We will go through the upper Adriatic in some places. We will go up and down, as you will see. I would say just enjoy the ride, and in the final part there will be some more synthetical ideas we can share, but just be prepared to have a lot of facts and ideas. I must say right away that it's still work in progress. What I propose today is, as I said, to share some ideas, hypotheses, so I'm open to any comment. So the lecture is entitled Odkrywanie dziedzictwa Habsburgów w socjalistycznej Jugosławii i poza nią. We will deal with the heritage of the Habsburgs, and heritage is to be understood in a very extensive way. We will talk about Socialist Yugoslavia and also what happened afterwards until today. And the idea is to see to what extent the maritime part of Croatia, so Istria, the city of Rijeka and Dalmatia, played a role in this rediscovery. We will first start with the a chronology, a reflection and chronology on dates, years that are important, that mark inflections in the history of modern Croatia, because those are the years that mark a new reappraisals of the Habsburg heritage. It is indeed very much under the impact of the changes of regimes that people renegotiated every time what they thought is important in that heritage. During the journey, as I said, we will change places, and my point is that every city has a single special history dealing with that heritage, and for the cities that we will explore, the sea is important. And what we will also see is that a way, at least the way I propose tonight to dive into that heritage question is through culture, through literature and visual arts. So we will have sources mixed and case studies that will appear in this series, Rijeka, and we will go back to Fiume. Some of you maybe have been present when my colleague Natka Badurina talked about Rijeka and Fiume in a very special moment. I will not deal with what she presented, the episode with D'Annunzio, but nevertheless, I will be dealing with Fiume as it was an Austrian city and what remains from that. We will go to Istria, Pola, and we'll go from Pola to Pola, Zadar in Dalmatia, Zara, and we will stop our journey in Split, Spalato, where we will have a questioning on the whole framework, the theoretical framework that can be engaged with when we think about heritage studies. And one of the elements I would like to present today is the idea that when we deal with Habsburg heritage in Dalmatia, in Croatia, we are not dealing only with that heritage in that part of Europe, but it has a wider significance. Maciej was kind enough to say that I did my first largest scale inquiry on the role of the German language in Croatia in the first half of the 19th century, so in Habsburg times. And indeed, what struck me when I first started dealing with that heritage as a PhD student was when I was strolling around the streets of old Zagreb upper city, those inscriptions on the in the streets. During Socialist Yugoslavia, the streets have had, like anywhere in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the labels of socialisms, and at the end of the period, the municipality discovered to uncover what was whitewashed for years. And what appeared then were the names of the streets in a bilingual way. So we have the German, and we have actually not the standard Croatian, but the Kajkavian dialect appearing on the street, on the walls, on the of the buildings of the city. So it would be very self-evident when we deal with the heritage of the monarchy to think that actually Zagreb, the continent, were the most important places where the revival, the reprisal, the rediscovery of the Habsburg heritage started, because it's obvious. If you have ever traveled to Croatia, you must have noticed how the architecture, how the cuisine is different from the continent and the littoral, the maritime part. And I certainly acknowledge the fact that there is a huge amount of scholarship that developed in Zagreb on the relationship between Zagreb and Vienna. Just that bibliographic information I mentioned here, it's an excellent book about the rediscovery of the monarchy in the social sciences in Zagreb. This is obvious. What I intend to say tonight is that there is some more obscure and invisible, evanescent way of rediscovering the heritage of the monarchy, and that way maybe has a lasting imprint. So, as I mentioned, the importance of the dates, the years. In 2 years, well, some historians can argue about that. Was it 1526 or 1527 when Croatia decided, or more precisely, the noblemen decided to vote for a Habsburg as a king of Croatia. So in a year or two, we will have a half millennium of Croatia having gone into the Habsburg Empire. And the key year in order to reflect on what remains afterward is 1918, the end of the First World War. I had the opportunity to present a paper in Warsaw, thanks to Paweł Rodak, who is here present and who organized a conference here in Warsaw on the year 1918. So that year is absolutely important, and at that conference I presented a paper on a writer who is very important in the Croatian history, Krleža, who was writing in Zagreb. Krleža is the kind of authors of the continental Croatia who had little understanding and interest for the maritime history of Croatia. So what we will think now is, how was the impact of that year 1918 on the littoral, on the maritime part? Even if Croatia is a small country, it has a great variety of territorial specificities. So even on the maritime part of Croatia, there are specific regions with their own history. So even if we can have the idea, which is on the whole correct, that roughly 1 century long, the maritime part of Croatia was part of the monarchy. 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, until 1918. This is roughly right, not completely. Whereas the continental part had 3 more centuries of symbiosis, in a way, with the Habsburg monarchy. An important moment in the end of the monarchy is the few days during which the parliament of the newly created states of the Slovenes, Croats and Serbs, October 29th, decided to sever the ties with the monarchy. We are here on the central place of Zagreb, and the parliament decides not to belong to the monarchy anymore. On December the 1st, there is the proclamation of the unification of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes in the newly founded kingdom in Belgrade. So 1918 is the end of the participation in an empire and the beginning of the participation in a kingdom. And of course, in the first years after 1918, there was a strong resentment against the monarchy and a lot of hopes linked with the newly founded kingdom. Alas, 10 years after the foundation, 1928, is the first episode of rejection of the new regime. In 1928, indeed, the uppermost popular representative of the Croatian opposition, Stjepan Radić, was shot dead in the parliament in Belgrade. And that episode of political violence inside the very building of the parliament suddenly made the Habsburg Empire appear as a place where opposition was possible, but violence had not reached that peak. Now, let's jump into the year 2018 as the end of the monarchy was remembered. The very popular magazine Večernji List had a special edition which had as a key issue the question of the role of the Croats in the First World War. The end of an era, of course, as we just have seen. And what they proposed in the magazine was, as they said, a journey into the unexplored part of Croatian history. And that unexplored part of Croatian history, that was also the question of the belonging to the Habsburg monarchy. In the editorial, the question was raised, how was it possible to relate to the soldiers who have died for the monarchy? And when I mention that, I say that historiography is still struggling with the way to address the question of an overall opinion about the participation of Croatia in the First World War. And I insist on that because once you have defined what you think about the end of the monarchy, the role of Croatia during World War I, then you can start appraise the whole heritage of the monarchy. So what I think is interesting here is the stance of the editorial saying our soldiers died on the wrong side and their goals were foreign to them. So here that journal wants to say that the Habsburg side was the wrong side. But more interesting is even the fact that they wanted to explore exactly what was at stake during the war, and through the history of the war, the culture, the heritage as the whole of the entire monarchy. If we go back in history, let us see how was that heritage tackled with in the years before 2018. So how can we follow the progressive development of a Croatian appraisal or reappraisal of that part of history? It has been noticed that in the 1980s, all across Central Europe, there was a new discovery of that concept of Mitteleuropa. And it is very appropriate here in the Austrian Cultural Center to reflect on that. Because Erhard Busek, Emil Brix were in the 1980s people who in the Austrian diplomacy developed a cultural diplomacy that was also eminently political. They thought about the ways Austria could develop a policy that would be adequate in the sense that was expected, that could give something to Central Europe. And so the Europäische Rundschau, a periodical that was published in Vienna, had an important role in developing a lot of important questions related to that heritage. 1986 also is the year of publication of a book for the larger audience, Als die Adria österreichisch war, when the Adriatic was Austrian. So we have a rediscovery, and that was a book for a larger audience with many pictures. So it was a way from Vienna to reappropriate the Adriatic heritage of the monarchy. 1986 is also the year of the publication of Claudio Magris's Danube. And if you mark the history of translations, you see that in Croatia the book was translated very soon, 1988, as soon as into German. Same thing with Marisa Madieri, the wife of Magris, who wrote and published 1987 her souvenirs, her memoirs of her childhood in Rijeka and in Istria, also very soon translated. So we see that in the 1980s, there was a parallel phenomenon of rediscovery of the Mediterranean and the Danube as places, axes of a memory of the Habsburg monarchy. During the years onward, there was a whole series of reflections on the concept of Mitteleuropa. Now, as I said in the introduction, what I want to explore now is how Mitteleuropa was not only a concept that was developed and quite successfully developed as a tool for the Austrian foreign policy, but it also implied a reappraisal of cultural history. And Dragutin Horvat is one of the scholars who in Croatia tried to reappraise what were the specific literary ties between Croatian literature, Croatian audience, and the novels, the literature that was created in the Habsburg monarchy. So the book of Horvat is interesting because it does not only describe the works of the Habsburg time, but how they were perceived in the Croatian audience. Now, 1986, more or less, 1985 exactly, in Istria, in Pula, the historian Miroslav Bertoša published one of his, say, seminal works, Ethos I Ethnos Zavičaja, Ethos and Ethnos of the Homeland. A very interesting book in which, as a historian who was educated partly in Paris at the School of the Annales, he was thinking in Brodelian categories of longue durée. Now, this is very interesting because in socialism, there were topics that were highly recommended. The history of the struggle of the partisans, so also the economic history, capitalism, socialism, but very rare were the historians who would think in longue durée on the secular questions of that population, mixed population on the maritime part of Croatia, and Istria was under Venetian rule for a very long time, and Bertoša is thinking in those Brodelian annal categories, how to think about those categories that were developed also in Italian historiography under the label of convivenza, suživot in Croatian, so the way that people lived together. His questions were about the Venetian period, but also on the period after Venice, and so that is the period under the Habsburg rule. And his other book, Istria Between Reality and Fiction, goes on reflecting on what historians can say beyond the myth of the convivenza. So what do the sources really say, and how can we approach what is commonly seen as a time of convivenza, of living together? Now I come to the first of the 4 case studies I will present. The city of Sankt Veit am Pflaum, Fiume Rijeka, a city that was developed mostly during the Habsburg period as a free harbor. You see here the cadaster of the 18th century as Fiume was developing as the harbor of Hungary, a counterpart of Trieste, which was developing as the main harbor of the Austrian part of the monarchy. And very obviously, since the 18th century, the buildings show how the harbor is developing thanks to the very liberal system under which the harbor could develop. Now, this is how it looked like during the years of the Habsburg monarchy, and you see the building, one of the main building, which is still standing on the maritime facade of the city, the palace in which now the most important naval company has its headquarters, and of course a large boat in front of it. So this is how the harbor looked like. And this is how it looked like in the 60s. You have that large boat, Yugoslavia, and the building, and this postcard in with no colors shows also what happened actually during most of the time under socialism. That is, even if you put the color on the postcards, you see that the facades were not really being cured. So it is one of the characteristics of socialism in Yugoslavia and elsewhere, of course, is that little money was spent on the appearance of the facades. So it was not at all important for the municipality to show that the buildings of the Austrian-Hungarian period were interesting as such. So they were not displayed as an element of touristic attractions at all. Actually, during that period, most of that heritage was silenced. Here you have a postcard of the 70s with the church. You have the skyscraper, what is called the skyscraper of Rijeka, late 30s. So it is the Italian period. And between the two, you have a very typical edifice of the Austrian-Hungarian period, the so-called Plöch Palace, 1888. Now, the money given for that, one of the most representative edifice of the town, was given by an engineer who worked in a fabric and an industry that was very much developed in the city, which is the torpedo. In Rijeka, there was an industry which was very successful in its domestic field and in the exportation, because that very engineer, Plöch, invented the way to hit boats and make them sink. Now, for decades, the place where torpedoes were made was not maintained. So the torpedo, that part of the industrial past, of which very few elements are still visible, was part of a local legend how industrial Rijeka was successful, but still very few things were done in order to maintain that industrial heritage. So that today, I had a conversation with the new director of the Museum of Rijeka, who told that the very state of the torpedo installation is so bad that it is hardly possible to do anything as a museal element that could be used. So that emphasizes the way that the city didn't really care about that period. But on the other hand, we have inside the buildings, and this is the city library, the old one. Now there's a new edifice. This is the old city library. In the library, and in that library, there was also there were also the premises of the Italian community. In those premises, in the editorial boards of local magazines, in publishing houses, there was something that was happening. And in the 1980s, 1, 2, 3 years after Magris published his book, we have books that were published in the city, a history of the city, a very interesting work of an art historian, very influential today, Radmila Matecic, who tried to interpret city buildings as layers of culture. And this is exactly what will develop afterwards. So Radmila Matecic was the first who, in the form of a book, did what cultural policies did afterwards, just unravel what was packed in buildings that no one really cared about during most of the decades after the Second World War. And a very interesting book that was published in 1991, but that was finished 3 years before, but could not find any publisher, Fiumanskie Priče, Stories of Fiume, and that, at that time, young scholar of hardly 30 years, used the Italian, Austrian name of the city to talk about the city. So to revigorate the importance of that heritage. In those years, still in Rijeka, but also in Zagreb, Nedeljko Fabrio, an author who had worked for years on a trilogy, the so-called Adriatic trilogy, with which he had a very great influence on the way that the heritage of the monarchy had on the Croatian audience. He was originally from Rijeka. He had ties with Trieste, but he was also having a role as later as an academician in Zagreb. So his books, novels, actually played with the documentary elements. Documentary and fiction, mixing facts and fiction. And the interesting thing with the first two titles of his trilogy is that the first uses an Italian word, cronisteria. The second one as an undertitle, a German undertitle, Familienfuge. And in both cases, it is about narrating how families lived under the monarchy. A topic that was for long not very popular in literature at all. So what Irvin Lukács and Edelko Fabrio showed in the late 1980s was that past could be, should be, had to be reincorporated into what? Into a specific question. Here I have translated a passage in the book in which it appears that for Lukács, the question of the monarchy is not a question of a large philosophical, historiographical importance. It is first of all the question of the city itself. For him, the people of the city have to reflect on their specific history through their reflection on what is left of their heritage they live with in the city. And the last sentence here is that he says the diversity of Fiume Rijeka is hushed up at this point, not even discussed. So what was asked by Lukács, Fabrio, Matecic was just to start talking about what was silenced, the fact that after World War II, there were people who came and who lived in those cities, well, as we know, what happens elsewhere in Central Eastern Europe. So a city where the Italian-speaking population, the German-speaking, the Hungarian-speaking population left, and what was left for the people who came into the city. Now, the interesting stylistic device in the book of Erwin Lukács is that it is sometimes an accumulation of words. And in a very interesting way, I think, he collects the elements that were very much discussed about that would define actually the Mitteleuropa concept. So in yellow, I marked the words I think that would be very much congruent with what Mitteleuropa was supposed to be about. And specifically the Austrian heritage, theater, and by the way, when he mentioned theater, he also thinks about an author who was rediscovered at that time, Ödön von Horváth, who is now very much played in Croatia, but for a long time he was absolutely ignored, even if he was born in Fiume. And after the book was published and after the history of theater was discussed in the city, there was a plaque that was put on the house where Ödön von Horváth was born. Customs, it is a harbor, Rijeka, ceremony, coffee houses, musicality, cheerfulness, irony, entrepreneurial spirit, cosmopolitanism, civilization. So all of this was a series of elements that Lukács suggests to care about and to rediscover in the heritage, literary heritage, but also in the architecture and so on. And now, an example that was documented. I told you that for a long time under socialism, people did not care in Rijeka very much about the heritage. But oral history show us that things can be a little more complex. Rijeka is a city with a shipyard. And you know in Poland very much that the people in the shipyard are people with a strong consciousness. Now, it is known that in the history of the symbol of the city, there is an interference with the people from the shipyard. And the story tells the following thing. The symbol of the city of Rijeka, of Fiume, was a double-headed eagle, double-headed, symbol of the monarchy. Now, it was given by Emperor Leopold I, 16th century, to the city as a free city. Now, when the Italians took the power in the city, they just took off one of the head of the eagle. And if you have just one head of the eagle, then you have a Roman eagle. So that was perfectly fitting for the Italian period. Now, when the communists came into the city, they didn't want any eagle, any monarchy, be it the Italian kingdom or the imperial monarchy. And so they asked the people from the shipyard to take the eagle from the top of the tower and smash it. And we have known recently that the people from the shipyard did not obey. They had to take the symbol, but they could hide away the pieces of the eagle, and those pieces were put together to have a new eagle put again on that bell tower many years after, 2017. So this is something of an invisible way of protecting the Habsburg heritage. Now, of course, the people from the shipyard did not protect the heritage of the Habsburg in its imperial dimension. They certainly defended something else, certainly something like their autonomy. Because the specific history of Rijeka is the history of an autonomous city. It was not a region, it was a city that was even a free city in the 1920s. Now we go to the second example in Istria, with that quote from an ethnographer, Lydia Nikochevich, who was for a long time the main curator and director of the Museum of Ethnography in Istria, in Labin, central Istria. And she made also oral history. She asked people, how do you represent the Habsburg heritage? What do you think? It was in the first years after 2000. And her way of dealing with that was, as we mentioned in the introduction, the question of the comparison. Okay, we had the Habsburgs. It was not perfect, but we had even worse. And so the quote shows that there was certainly a kind of idealized way of projecting the Austrian past in Istria. If we think about the way that people in Istria dealt with that Habsburg heritage, we must not forget that Pula is the city where the Roman heritage is present. And actually, the first archaeologists who worked in Pula in order to maintain the Roman heritage left a very deep imprint for all the archaeologists that came afterwards. So even under socialism, it was the foundation given by the Austrian archaeologists that played the role in the way that the arena, for instance, which is the symbol of the city, was cared about. Now, in 1986, again, we have a very important publication about a library that was given, that was refounded, actually. The story goes as follows. Pula was the naval center of the monarchy, and there was a school for officers. They had a library in the days of the monarchy. Now that library was dismantled after the First World War, and only in 1975 an agreement with the Austrian government made it possible for the books to come back to Rijeka. Now those books, there's thousands of books, were most of them written in German. And mark that at that moment in Pula, there was no university at first and no German section. So for years, as the book shows, the books that were that came back from Vienna remained unread because there was no one to read those books in German. And only progressively, the library itself changed its status and became a protected heritage, but only after the end of Yugoslavia in 1992. Now, one a further example I would like to show you about the kind of invisibility of that heritage and still its lasting presence. You see here how the biggest ship of the monarchy sank on the very first day of peace, the 1st November 1918. Two Italians didn't want the Austrian ship to become a part of the Yugoslav Navy, so they sank it, and during that, so they put some mines that exploded, and historians, it was in the harbor of Pula, and historians think that 300 to 400 crew members died that day at the dawn of the peace. So very tragic fate of people who died on the first day of the peace. And the question for a long time was what to do with that boat which sank in the harbor of Pula, and what to do with the memory of the people who died. Once again, it's the question in the editorial. What did those people fight for? If we look at the newspapers when that happened, it's interesting to see that pan-Slavic enthusiasm in Pula. So that very first day of peace, when the naval, the boats of the monarchy had to become Yugoslav, the journal said that the Czechs and the Poles who were in the harbor rejoiced with the South Slavs because of that new period that was beginning with the Yugoslav Navy. Now, again, in the 1980s, we have a fictionalization with documents, a very interesting parallel phenomenon in Austrian and in Croatian literature. Two books dealt with the fate of the people who were employed on the ships of the Austrian Navy, Ransmayr, 1984, Ivan Katušić, 1987. And you see on the cover, it is a montage with that sinking boat, that very sinking boat we saw. And it is the question about the people who died. And there is a person who is especially at the center of that story and history, it is the admiral. The admiral of the army was of Croatian descent, and he decided to remain on the boat, and he died because he didn't want to leave the boat without his crew. But he saved the lives of the Italians who put the mines, because he wanted them to be judged. So that admiral of the Austrian army has become a place of memory. And the cemetery where he was buried has become, in the 1960s, very progressively a place of memory. But only in the 1990s, in cooperation with the Austrian Red Cross, there was a design made in order to maintain the place where his memory is alive, in a plaque given by his, or that had been inscribed by his widow. And the cemetery, the naval cemetery, is now maintained as a place of memory for the people who died in that catastrophe. Here is the image of an Italian spectacle that was done after the history of the sinking of the Viribus Unitis, which is, by the way, an extremely interesting history, because the two Italians who put the mines on the Viribus Unitis had completely opposite political ways. One became a fascist and the other an opponent to fascism, and both have written their autobiography, and both relate to the sinking of the Viribus Unitis and reflect on that, what they have done, and the one saying that it was Italian patriotism, and the other one, it was nonsense. In the harbor of Pula, they tried to save the carcass of the Viribus Unitis, but not very much was left. And this is the beginning, in the 1980s, 90s, this is the beginning of underwater archaeology. And we are coming here to another invisible heritage on the surface. But underneath the surface, there is an exploding interest for underwater archaeology for the remnants of the Austrian past. Because not only the Viribus Unitis was drowned in the Adriatic, there is a whole bunch of names. For instance, here, the Baron Gauch, 1918, and here you have archaeologists working on the carcass of the vessel. And actually what is developing is the methodology in order to protect the naval remnants of the monarchy. Why protect? Because amateur divers have discovered that while spending their holiday on the coast, the author can dive not that profoundly and find extraordinarily picturesque landscapes of vessels. And it had become an endangered heritage, so that the archaeologists developed a special device, a special system of protection. And as a professional magazine now says, Submerged Heritage, so a publication entirely devoted to underwater heritage, that methodology of protecting the vessels has been rewarded by the UNESCO. So you see that on the top of the bell tower and underneath the water, we have elements of heritage that are very symbolic. Third example, which I will deal with more briefly, Zara Zadar. We are here in Dalmatia. 1945, the city was heavily damaged by bombs. 1991, during the demise of Yugoslavia, bombs also fell on the city. And again, to think about the Austrian heritage is to think about the moment when there are discontinuities. Again, the question of World War I, what to record about 1998. Now, there was, in 1991, an exhibition at the Museum of Zadar about the First World War, and what the museum curator said is that there was a lack of documents in Zadar in order to show exactly what was the life during First World War. But what they say is that in families there were records, there were souvenirs, memories, so no documentation as such, but oral history, oral memory. Now, an example I want to show you is one part of the city that was very much designed under Austrian auspices. It is the garden. In the late 1820s, a general was in charge as a governor of the city, and he decided to have a garden. The garden had a cafe, it had a sumptuous view, and especially when the snow was falling. And in a guide that was issued in Vienna a couple of years afterwards, it appears that actually the garden was meant just, of course, for the elite of the society. Now, interesting, when the garden was opened in 1828, the local poet praised the fact that no French scissors harmed the branches. So there was an act of patriotism in doing that actually English garden. So this is how it looked like from above on a day, a very rare day when it snows in Dalmatia. So that was a view from the garden on the city. But actually, when I first made an inquiry on the history of the garden, it was 2006, it was really in a poor state. So even after socialism, there was a lack of interest for that place. And I remember that there were very few people who were wandering in that garden. Now that looks better. It's 10 years after, and you see it has been renewed in a good way. And now it's very full of people, tourists, and a lot of noise also because there is a cafe bustling with people and music all the day. So those are the inscriptions that you can see in the garden. And recently, there was that plaque that was put on one wall surrounding the place, in which the Croatian-Austrian cooperation is underlined. So that, quote, oasis of peace is a sign of thankfulness for the transformation of the bulwarks into gardens. Now, we are in the years 2010, more or less. It is a period when an Austrian library was opened in the city. 2013 is the year of accession of Croatia to the European Union. So we see that in the wake of those processes, there is a new interest in that past. Now, it is also inscribed because in the interest garden is part of the program that was launched by the city to be part of an international project of conservation under the aegis of the UNESCO of the Venetian ramparts. Now, the Austrian part of it is just inside the Venetian walls. So the UNESCO protects the Venetian past, as in cities in northern Italy, up down to Montenegro in Kotor, but the Austrian garden is de facto part of the UNESCO preserved area. So it's an invisible present, an elusive past. This is a quote from an interesting a book of Hermann Bahr, the Austrian writer, who describes the city of Zadar as a city where the Austrians built a wall to protect them from that oriental city inside the walls. So this is how it looked like. Now, the history of the Austrian heritage in the city of Zadar is specific due to the fact that the city was Italian-speaking until World War II and was part of Italy in the interwar period. And actually, one of the central place of meeting in the Austrian period was the Café Central, which was actually transformed during the Italian period, in the interwar period, and transformed so as to be not recognizable anymore, so that the destruction and oblivion of the Habsburg layer started in the interwar period. But the interesting thing is that in the 1970s, there was an aesthetic reappraisal. So actually, interesting is that we have a lot of postcards that were shown in the 1970s, and through photographs that passed, that was shown again. Now, in Zadar, there is a series of new program that was meant to give new new life to the buildings of the Austrian period. So there are visible elements. And the most obvious is the way that that heritage is transformed, and is transformed from an old industry of the Austrian times to the new industry of today, which is tourism. So, for instance, you see here the new distillery that was opened in 1913, Marasca, so cherry juice and alcohol, beverages, and so on. And just in a few weeks, a new Hyatt hotel will be opened there in that distillery. But interesting is also that in Zadar there are small hotels which play with in a very subtle way, I think, almost invisible way with the Austrian past. The example here is the Almaja Hotel, which states that they relate to a figure appearing in the novel of Alessandro Barrico, Oceano Mare, but I think it is not what they say, but I think it is also related to the Joseph Conrad Almaja's Folly. But what I want to say is that they do not openly rely to the Austrian period. this is a quote from the official page of that new boutique hotel. So they relate to antiquity, to the Venetian past, and they relate to the Austrian past with words like fin de siècle, golden age of bourgeois Zadar. But they have an exhibition of photographs, and here they have a very interesting exhibition of a German artist, who Wolfgang Brenner, who shows that very intriguing picture on which you can see an inscription. The question of the preservation. Mittlerweile du bist konserviert im Bernstein der Erinnerung. Now you are preserved in the amber of memory. Now, amber of memory, I think, is a very fitting metaphor for what is happening with the Austrian heritage. Now, this is a hypothesis, but the interesting thing is that Wolfgang Brenner was implied in a project called Inspiracja, and he was active in Poland and actually in Przemysl, a very important place of Austrian memory in Poland. So in this way of dealing with the Austrian past, I think they have come in the Almayer Hotel to a kind of evanescent but still present idea of the memory. So the memory itself is an act of creation. The photographs and the way they deal with that past without naming it is a way of relating, I think, to it. The last part, which is a conclusion, is spalato, split. I want to mention it because now we enlarge our focus. Alois Riegel is nowadays thought as one of the most important theorists of the conservation and of museum conservation, art history. Why? Because in the scholarship he developed in the first years of the 20th century, he developed the question of the preservation of all the layers. Now, Split is a city with a Roman past, a very strong Roman past. And the local archaeologist Frane Bulic, a priest, was very active and worked with Alois Riegel. But they had a fight, a theoretical fight on the preservation policy. This is how the palace of Diocletian, so the core of the city of Split, looked like under socialism. And actually, this is how more or less it is today. But this is why we can see it today, that is, with all the layers from antiquity to the 20th century, because Alois Riegel was one of the very first who said, and he opposed the local, he said, we must destroy nothing. Whereas the priest, Frane Bulic, wanted to wipe out everything that was not Roman. And Alois Riegel fought very hardly to save all the stratas. Now, Alois Riegel, for decades, was more or less forgotten. But in the 1970s, he was rediscovered again, and his fame is just growing. Now, the 1970s is the period when in Socialist Yugoslavia, in Split, they prepared the city as a candidate for UNESCO preservation. And they succeeded in it, 1979. Dubrovnik and Split were the first cities on the Yugoslav list. But what I mean is that the protection was very much that Austrian imprint. Now, another phenomenon is that in the 1960s, the peristyle was used for a performance. The students of the Academy of Art in January 1968 put red paint on the Roman pavement. And still today, people are wondering, what was that? What kind of happening was that? There is no written evidence. So the students were persecuted, some of them fled, some of them even committed suicide. So we don't have an interpretation by the actors themselves. But we know that in 1968, they wanted to say something. Was it the red color of communism they wanted to show as a brutalism? And it was a year of turmoil. But the interesting thing is that they were just repeating what happened at the very end of the monarchy in 1913. For the first time, that very center place of the city was used for the very first time as a place of representation of theater. So the center place, that red one, was used as for a theater performance, and since then, that peristyle, again, preserved by Alois Riegel as such, played that role as a place of potential expression of, whatever, but a way of expressing something to an audience in the city. Now, of course, after the fall of socialism in Split, like in Zadar, like in Pula, like in Rijeka, we have art historians who were very active in relating to the architectural past. And you have two monographs here on buildings and architects of the Austrian period who were active. This is a very interesting entry also about a building in which Freud was having his had a stay while he was in Split. Now, the conclusion. We had a journey through the practice of the protection of the Austrian Habsburg heritage. And we ended with that more theoretical part. Now, the questions that are still here are that petrified, remember the amber, that petrified, evanescent memory, is it a commodified memory? I mentioned tourism industry. Of course, this plays an instrumental role. So do we see now that heritage just as a way of attracting tourists? Or do we have what scholars of memory studies call multidirectional memories? So, of course, we have questions about what a nation has to say about heritage, what a city, what city policy are made, what communities, whatever communities are made of. But my take is also that we have to see it also on an individual scale, and also see what individual people, hotel owners, artists, whoever do with that part. So that was it, and I end the presentation with that portrait of Alois Riegel. And so there's two, I mentioned there's two books that are related to Dalmatia, to Split. His study on the art industry that was founded on the ground of the analysis of the Roman past, and the question of the cult of the monument. And this is exactly what we are dealing about. So the cult of the monuments, and if I am very pleased today to present you that research, it is certainly due to the analysis of Riegel, who showed that in our days, when this is the idea, the religions wither away, we have that new cult of monument, the cult of history that kind of replaces our religious needs. Thank you.
I'm very interested of your opinion about differences, possible differences is a question, because I'm not sure of it, towards the Habsburg past in Croatia, I mean in north of Croatia and in Dalmatia. Because regarding the different history of these two regions, and you showed to us at the beginning at least 400 years of Habsburg rule in Croatia, and only 100 and so in Dalmatia. Can we generalize about different attitudes towards the Habsburg presence? For instance, in Zagreb, or that Zagreb centered Croatia, and at the Adriatic coast?
No, I think we can't generalize. And of course, there are layers of memory that are very deep in northern continental Croatia, no doubt about this. And let's start from, as I mentioned, the way people eat and the way people sometimes even acknowledge nowadays their relationship with that past. Now, as I tried to say, I think even in northern, I mean, even in Istria, it's not the same than in Dalmatia, and even in Zadar, it's not the same as in Split, and it would be even different in Dubrovnik. I didn't mention Dubrovnik, which is a case in itself, because in Dubrovnik there is a Habsburg heritage which is almost invisible, but which is very important. There are some parts, some people, most of the people even are not aware that there is a part in the very central part of Dubrovnik. When you are on the main street, the Stradun, you look at the bell tower. The bell tower is a Habsburg insert. It is not Baroque. It is the policy of urbanism of the Habsburg times. So there is, and some people in Dubrovnik are aware, the people who have roots in the city, they know what is Ragusan, local time of architecture, and what is the Habsburg time. And very recently, there was a book issued by a local writer there who wrote a very anti-Habsburgic novel. So there is also a black legend about the Habsburg rule in Dubrovnik. Just a few words about that, because I didn't say a word about it before. So a local memory, why a black legend? Because the Habsburgs were the first who really ruled in Dubrovnik after the fall of the Republic. There was, of course, a period of time when the French were in office, but it was so short that it really didn't leave an imprint. Now, the local memory, or some local memory, sees the Habsburgs are the ones who really definitely erased the autonomy of the city. So what I wanted to say is, I think we always have to scale our inquiry. What territory and what people are we interested in, and in their relationship to that heritage. And once we have defined that the perimeter of our inquiry, I think we can get specific answers.
Yeah, thank you, because I thought, as you said, as an answer to my question, it's hard to generalize, but yeah, thank you.
Maybe it's continental Croatia is part of Cisleitania, and that's the difference, and Dalmatia is part of Transleitania. And I want to ask why those in Istria had idealizing the Austria as a like ideal country. I know because I'm from Bosnia, we have same idealizing the Austria. Why in Istria? I didn't see that part of idealizing in Split or Zadar, and why Istria? And also, I want to add how in Zagreb is anti-Hungarian. Like they have anti-Hungarian policy, but they got anti-Austrian policy when Ante Starčević started to promote his policy, his Croatian national identity in the Croatia in the parliament.
Yes, thank you. Let's go back to that quote from that ethnographer who tried to explain that idealization. So what she says, she writes that after having interviewed people, so what did the people say? They were emphasizing its democracy and, well, affection. So why do they promote that idealization? Because you see, the two regimes that came after were the fascist and the communist. And in Istria, the period after World War I was a traumatic period for the Croats and the Slovenes, because they were really persecuted by the Italians. And so afterwards, in families, they related to the time before they were part of the Kingdom of Italy. That was the period when they could have their Slavic names. You know, many people had their names Italianized in Istria, and some people had to flee. And so this explains why there are those layers of memory and certainly idealization, because what they remember is that it was even worse afterwards. The second thing is, I think in Istria they try also to use the Austrian past in order to make it something useful. So it's not a kind of idealization, but very pragmatic. I name an example. What was very important during the Habsburg era in Istria is that the railroad came. And as you know, in Bosnia, the Austrian rule developed the railroad. And it was very important for those places very isolated before. And even if it was a small gauge railroad, still it was the end of a feeling of being enclaved. And so when the railroad from Pula to Trieste worked, and Pula to Trieste, that meant you can go then to Vienna. This railroad was called the Parenzana because it first connected the city of Parenzo, Porec, with Trieste. Now, it is a railroad that doesn't work now for decades. And so what did the local population decide to do? Okay, what to do with that, with those lines? Let's make a cycling way. So they used the remnants of the way that was dug. So what remained was reused for bicycles. So now the idea is to go on the traces of the Habsburgs with your bicycle, and you go from Porec to Trieste or whatever, and you cycle and you admire the landscape, of course, but they do put an emphasis on the Habsburg legacy. So you cycle where your ancestors could use the train, and you open it to the public. So this is what I think is interesting. So they kind of reuse that past in different ways.
I wanted to ask about one thing which relates what you said before, which you said actually now, about this pragmatical way of thinking to giving the railway. What I was thinking about is, it refers to many things you mentioned. It's really interesting. You mentioned that asking about Habsburg legacy is asking about cities' continuities, right? Okay, so this is, forgive me, things that I don't know. Is it true that there was a big people exchange in those cities after World War II, right? Okay, and okay, city continuity, because some of those cities were part of Republic of Venice before French Napoleon Wars.
Exactly.
But not Rijeka. Rijeka was Hungarian harbor. And what about this? I want to ask about economies, in terms of economies of Venetian cities, because as I understand, in Republic of Venetia they were focused on maritime trade, and the cities were really good developing, and when French and Austrians came, it stopped, because this maritime trade stopped to be really important. This political power, which Venetia was, disappeared, and a new economic center in shape of Vienna became a power. And as I understand, Dalmatia was like almost out of Austrian economy. I mean, all those trade paths were out of it, and yeah, is it that economy went worse in 19th century generally, and those railroads seems to be, some poor ersatz, let's say. What about it? Is it present in people's thinking, or is maybe what I'm saying some incorrect?
Well, thank you. That is indeed a very important question. And with that, we can deal with the question of reality and myth. Now, Dalmatia has been, and maybe is still, a periphery. So in the realm of Venetia, it was used for economic purposes by the political economic elite of Venetia, of the Republic, for international trade to the Levant and further on, sure. And this is a period of major architectural masterpieces. For instance, if Zadar now is on the UNESCO list, it's because of the ramparts, magnificent ramparts, and so on. Right. But that trade was a monopoly. I'm speaking about the Republic of Venice. A monopoly, meaning that people in Dalmatia had to buy only goods from the Republic. They were not allowed to make anything on the place with their goods. They could not exchange their goods. Everything had to be brought to Venice. And they had to buy from Venice. So this is why there is in Dalmatia, and especially in the northern part of the coast, a black legend of Venice. That black legend, so which is partly true and partly is not, encompasses also the question of the landscape. Because in Dalmatia there are some lush parts, and around Zadar it's quite fertile. So this is why there are some cherries with which they can make liquors and so on. But if you go up north to the Rijeka, you see the karst, you see deforested regions, and the legends has it that Venice took the trees, the forests, from the mountains in order to build in the laguna of Venice the city, and which is partly right. And for a long time, people lived in that desolated area because, they said, of the Venetians who took everything from them and didn't give them the possibility to build something new. And now, why a legend? Because we know that the people, once the forest was taken away, didn't take care of planting some new trees. So there was a vicious circle, and so people were surrounded by that desolate landscape, and they were poor. Now, of course, Dalmatia was a privileged position only for people who were high-ranked in the Venetian hierarchy, not for the rest. Now, was it better or worse under the Austrian rule? Well, I think it was still a periphery, and if there is a comparison to be done, it's certainly with Galicia. Very periphery, very poor, and some policy coming from Vienna, but not very much. And I remember having compared some elements of the demography, economy, and it's very comparable. For instance, Galicia and Dalmatia, very comparable. And for instance, the illiteracy, the amount of people who were not able to write and read was about 90%. And so we have very analogous situations in Galicia and Dalmatia. And so that's why it was, I think, yes, still a periphery. And then again, you compare a regime with the former one. And very common in the Austrian period, And this is what the governors of Dalmatia, the Austrian ones, would complain. Why do the people in Dalmatia always say that the French were better than we? Why were they better? Well, they remained just a couple of years, less than 10 years, but they started building roads. Of course, they didn't have time. Napoleon didn't stay too much in charge. But the people, for decades, would think that, if the French could have stayed a longer period of time, maybe we could have a better development.
We in Poland have a similar way of thinking generally.
And then again, when the communists came in rule, people would complain, if we could have stayed more under the Austrians, then we wouldn't have that situation in which we see us like the Balkans. This is a word I didn't pronounce yet, the Balkans, because very important, and maybe, yes, here something that can be generalized about that heritage for the whole of Croatia. This is the comparison Austria, Central Europe, Middle Europa versus Balkans. And as I showed, the 1928 funeral of Stjepan Radić in Zagreb, the question was, well, what a decadence we in Croatia have experienced from a periphery of Austria. We have become even worse, the periphery of a Balkan state. So always those criteria of comparison appearing. But as I said, historians of economy show us that on the whole, no idealization should be done, nor for the Venetian period, nor for the Austrian, actually.
Was it a way to dig this out from the history and make it Austrian soft power into the Balkans? Again, I mean, yeah, cultural soft power.
Yes, I would say yes. And it's cultural diplomacy. Every country, or some country, say, develop their own diplomacy. And in that respect, I would compare Austria and France. And I think those two European countries put very much emphasis on culture as a way of showing their presence. And I think what the Austrian cultural diplomacy started in 1980s is still very visible today. And in the 1980s, there were the ideas of developing a very specific way of implementing cultural diplomacy through the way of libraries, the Österreich-Bibliotheken. The first one was actually opened in Krakow, and from then on, it spread all over the world. Now, of course, it's diplomacy, it's cultural diplomacy, and as such, it has to be reviewed, analyzed as how a country wants to assess itself, wants to weigh in a certain sense. But then again, why not having books as a proof of your presence than, I don't know, any other product? And I mean, it works, and sometimes it doesn't completely work. I remember having done in an inquiry on the situation in Transylvania. I was interested by the Austrian library in Cluj, Kolozsvár, Klausenburg, and I remember having read the Golden Book of that Austrian library. I was wondering, well, what do the people receive? What do they expect and what do they get when they go to that Österreich Bibliothek? And again, it's very interesting because then you really see what cultural diplomacy makes. It's very difficult to measure the impact of cultural diplomacy because it's not like how many, I don't know, weapons you have sold, but how many books have you given for someone to read, and what do the people do with those books? Now, the interesting source I had in Cluj was going through the various comments. I had some people saying, and it was in the years 2000, some people would say, thank you, I thank the Austrian embassy for opening that library in Transylvania, making us acquainted with our past. Okay, but there were other people who would say, who would write, thank you, Austria, for making me understand better that foreign culture. But then again, I come back to something you said in your first question, that was demography. And we come back to that. So in cities in which demographic changes have been so brutal, of course, you have people who come with very various backgrounds, and for them, Austria might mean something in the family memory or nothing at all. But they gather in some way, means those spaces created by the Austrian diplomacy, and then people do what they want to do with that.
I started to wonder what would be the outcome of trying Germany and Austria using Mittel Europa as something positive in Poland. Good luck.
But you're right. Just the concept of Mittel Europa is very polysemic, and indeed, what Busek and Brix did in the 1980s was to reinvent Mittel Europa in a new way. They refashioned it because the legacy was a bleak one. Friedrich Naumann, a monopoly, very centered on Germany. And they used the same word, and they gave it a new, fresh, and opposite meaning to the Friedrich Naumann concept.
You told about some other looking at set of mind of continental Croatians and maritime Croatians. What I'm thinking is comparison to Poland, where whole Polish history is continental. When we were trading, we had Gdańsk, but we didn't control it. It was in hands of free city of Gdańsk, Dutch people, Jews, everyone. But we started to thinking about sea, maritime, only in 20th century. Is this somehow visible in Croatia? Which when I think about Croatia, I think about sea. Mm-hmm. There are mountains between continental and maritime Croatia. There is this Danube river isn't connected with Adriatic Sea. Is it visible in mental of those people, or due to population exchanges, it is this difference is erased?
Yes, very good remark indeed. And actually, very good that you mentioned Gdańsk, because I think there is a very rich topic that could be developed on the comparison between Gdańsk and Rijeka. Fiume. Why? Because exactly as you mentioned, actually the people who made Fiume work as a major harbor were not Croats. They were Hungarians, Italians, Jews, Austrians, not Croats. They were living in the suburbs until World War II. The majority of the population was not speaking Croatian. There were some people, but not the majority. And so the history of Rijeka, which is the major harbor in the modern times after the fall of Dubrovnik, is very, very rich. And actually, the people who made Fiume work as a major harbor were not Croats. They were Hungarians, Italians, Jews, Austrians, not Croats. They were living in the suburbs until World War II. The majority of the population was not speaking Croatian. There were some people, but not the majority. And so the history of Rijeka, which is the major harbor in the modern times after the fall of Dubrovnik, is this is the label that was used in Austria, in the Habsburg monarchy, corpus separatum. It was a corpus separatum in a judicial way, because it was a Hungarian enclave on the sea. The Croats had no power on the way the city could develop. It was a corpus separatum, and in the memory, it was for a long time a corpus separatum. Rijeka is something else. And still very important, because it was giving so much influx of people and goods and everything. So yes, it is a very specific situation, but it is just one of the harbors, and in history, well, there is a more glorious history in maritime history, and this is Dubrovnik, Ragusa. So in Croatian memory, you would emphasize that glorious history of maritime expansion, even being a rival, more or less, legend also, but partly true, to Venice, but never part of the Venetian dominion. So you think of that and not of Fiume.
Yeah, right.
But in the modern time, very comparable to Gdańsk, I would say. And also the fact that there is near Fiume, you have Abbazia, so there is 2-3 cities, like around Gdańsk. So it's a kind of microcosm, a cosmopolitan microcosm inside or at the marginality, but very central too. So yes, from the Baltic to the Adriatic, I think we have here something very interesting as a parallelism, like Dalmatia and Galicia, that would also be interesting to compare that in the perspective, in a historical perspective.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe very briefly, thank you very much for this lecture. For me, it's especially very important because my alma mater is University of Rijeka. And I want to ask you 2 questions. One is about the political discourse in Croatia. We saw like the 80s and 90s, there are the times of rediscovering the past. Did you think that, like, when we think about the Yugoslav wars in the 91, 92 in Croatia, that was this big argument that Croatia is not in the Balkans and that they can regain the support of the Western countries? And coming back a little bit more to the politics, Viktor Orban has Rijeka on his maps, Greater Hungary, and also the last diplomatic scandal with giving the maps for, I think, the Hungarian in Brussels. They gave to Croatian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Can you comment this a little bit for us? I'm really curious of your opinion about taking these historical points as a political.
Yes, actually, when we speak about memory, we actually speak about the present situation. And indeed, what is happening today and for more than a decade in Hungary is a rediscovery, but I don't know. It's not a rediscovery. I think in Hungary they never forgot that Adriatic window that Fiume represented. I remember for decades I have studied in Budapest, so I'm acquainted with the libraries and the exhibitions. And I remember when I studied there in the 1980s, there were already always exhibitions and they have an incredible amount of documents on the history of Fiume Rijeka in Budapest. And those documents are private collections. The people who used to live in Fiume, they went back or went to continental Hungary with a whole bunch of postcards, books, memorabilia, and it's always on display. And anyway, when you go to Budapest, you go through the Fiume-út, the road to Fiume. So it's inscribed in the geography of the city. Now, what is happening is that with Orbán, we slip from nostalgia to political calculation. But not only political. Well, yes, you mentioned that very last, say, scandal, but it's on its way since years, because the Historical Institute that was founded recently really wants to address Hungary as the kingdom of Hungary in its width. And it's a program that has developed in the last years, which is not very visible yet, but there is a wish to buy some shares in the harbor of Rijeka.
Yeah, like now the Czechs has the ownership of Rijeka port authority, and previously it was a Polish company. Yeah?
Yes, but the Hungarian companies also buy some parts of the port. So they do want to have their share to a lesser extent. But it is also advertised that Orbán, since he was married, always spends at least a week in a hotel in Opatija. So that relates also to his fellow citizen, that that part of the coast was part of their history. And again, it shows that people in Hungary have their own family histories, and you cannot take that from them away. It is part of their history. But the thing that remains is what you do if it goes too far. Well, you protest, and you see what happens. But indeed, we are speaking here about that phenomenon of nostalgia that can feed something that is not nostalgia, that is a kind of wish to come to a revision of history. So we will see how it develops.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for your lecture. I have also two small questions exactly connected with these problems. So the first one, you showed us many examples of from literature, many examples of buildings and also from historical books. But my question is, which is the place now in I can say you said about the cultural politics, or we can in Poland we say about the politics of history. So, for example, which is the place of Habsburg legacy in the museums? Because museums today is very important cultural institutions, or I don't know if you know, maybe you know, or for example in the school manuals, in the school textbooks. So this is the first one. And the second one, could you say a little bit more about these relations between family memory, and because we have on the one hand we have a family memory, we have of course historical studies, and we have the more official politics of history or cultural politics. There are any tensions today between these three kinds of thinking about history? Of course, yes, must be. But could you say a little bit more about this place of Habsburg heritage in family history, in historical studies, and in more official institutions, historical institutions?
Museums. There is a whole range of new museums, city museums that have been recently refurbished, and the very interesting examples in our conversation today is the case study of Rijeka and Zadar, because in Zadar, just recently, 2 years ago, the new city museum reopened, and it was installed in the former place of the Venetian government. It was a year-long process of making it available again for the public. Yes, we have. I will show you how it looked like in the early 90s when, you see, so this is part of the city that was shelled. So the museum, what is now the museum, was heavily damaged. So now it's the Venetian governor. But inside that Venetian building, there is a place for the Austrian memories, which is related to Italianate culture, because the city, Zadar, was the capital of Dalmatia with a predominantly Italian-speaking population. So this is a time of a very developed Italian culture, and this is what the exhibition shows. Whereas in Rijeka, the museum, a new museum, just opened last year. And it is, so the Austrian history is not in the museum. The museum is in the Austrian building. It's in an old sugar refinery, because Rijeka was a place in the Austrian period, was a place where sugar cane was imported and transformed into sugar. And now the museum is there, and showing that industry, and the tone of the exhibition is very much to emphasize the entrepreneurial habit of the bourgeoisie. So it really puts an emphasis on the development of the city in the Austrian time, Hungarian time, very much. Whereas the museum before, the city museum, was a creation of Socialist Yugoslavia, and it was the museum of the revolution. So, of course, with another narration of the past, and centered on on World War II. Now, your question about family, historical studies, institutions. Family, it's very varied, but I would say it's kind of fading away now. Lydia Nikochevich, whom I quoted, she made her oral history inquiries in 20 years ago, maybe even more, and I think it was more present at that time than today. So it's evaporating in family histories. But in literature, we have more and more cases of that history that is coming back. We have family histories. A now quite popular woman writer from Slavonia, so not from the coast, but from that part, not far away between Bosnia and Hungary, a writer, Ivana Šojat, wrote a novel, and she called it Unterstadt, so the title of the book is in German, and it's the story of 3 generations of women living in Slavonia. So this is the way that memory is, memorialized in the public sphere. School books, the government has no monopoly anymore on the publishing of school books, so there is a variety of school books. And so it certainly would be interesting to see how every school book features the Austrian memory. There can be differences according to the authors. Now, historical studies are well developed in the world, in the academic world in Croatia for years, and it's How is the situation now? Well, I would say it's really developing, and the thing that developed very much in the last 20 years is the Department of German Studies in Rijeka, in Split. They opened German studies at the universities, and this means that people really can engage with that past, which was not the case beforehand. In my PhD, I worked on the first ever school teacher that used to teach German, and I made a prosopography, and it was not difficult because in Dubrovnik in the 19th century, I found, I think, 3 or 4. So it was very minimal. There was no real policy of Germanizing the people, and in historical studies there, not many people could really engage with that for a long time. And now it's changing. And I think it's quite diverse, and cultural studies are quite developed. And institutions, as far as I can follow that, I have the feeling that institutionally it truly works. Well, this is what was mentioned, the idea that the Habsburg legacy is what differentiates Croatian history from Serbian or Bulgarian, say, history. So there has been a long emphasis on that. But the interesting thing is, I think, that some people are aware in Croatia that what again differentiates the Habsburg legacy in Croatia is that it was it was on the border with the Ottoman, the Balkan legacy. And for me, at least, one of the most interesting program of research is called Triplex Confinium. Triplex Confinium is the triple border, the Austrian, the Ottoman, and the Venetian. And the program wants to investigate the people behind the border. What does it mean to live on a border? So isn't there a specificity of the people who lived indeed in a society that was itself on the border and on the border, yes, between Croatia and Bosnia? There was a region called the military frontier. So this is a specificity that historians address. What is it to be at the border of the Austrian, but also of other imperial structures? It's a program that has been launched some 20 years ago, and it still goes on.
Dziękuję bardzo.